for being here. All right, I'm just getting set up on YouTube, and then we will get started. It's like hit or miss whenever I try to go over to YouTube, but actually it looks like it's working. All right, excellent. And background, of course, is my hometown of Miami Beach. And welcome, everyone. Okay, so episode 85 of Wednesday Night Live is going to be talking about managing blood sugar and insulin. But as I said, we'll be focusing mostly on insulin tonight. And my goal by the end of tonight is, one, for you to understand insulin, try to figuring out whether that might be a problem for you. Many of you know, if you've been listening to me over the last year and a half, that getting a fasting insulin level is something that I think will become standard as medicine progresses. Right now, not all your doctors are going to check your insulin levels. Endocrinologists definitely check, but unfortunately, and then of course people into lifestyle medicine like myself check, but generally your general doctor isn't going to be checking for insulin usually, because, you know, quite frankly, you'll understand this in just a moment, you know, just having sort of a diagnosis of having some insulin resistance where your insulin is not doing what it's supposed to do, or it's not reaching its end target, so to speak, that in and of itself can elicit your doctor to start treatments and things like that. We're not going to get into all those sort of details, but let me share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, let's see. Okay. All right. So let me blow up my screen here a little bit. Hopefully you can see the screen well. And as always, if you have any questions, definitely type them into the chat box and I'll be happy to answer them. So I entitled it Managing Glucose and Insulin, but really, as I said, we're really going to be focusing on insulin. So let's go through the definition so you really have a clear understanding of what glucose and what insulin, what they are, and how they are involved in human health. So many of you know that glucose is basically blood sugar. Definition is a simple sugar, which is an important energy source in living organisms and is a component of many carbohydrates. Now, most people don't actually understand the difference between blood sugar and starch. Now, glucose, which is blood sugar, which we just spoke of, is of course a type of sugar, and there are different types of sugars. There's fructose, we've spoken about that. That's like a fruit sugar. There's sucrose, which is basically glucose, I think attached to fructose. All of these things break down into, they can break, if there's a glucose particle on it, it breaks down into glucose. Now, starch is actually like a chain, and each link in the chain is a glucose particle. So what happens is when you eat starch, you have an enzyme that comes in and it basically clips off each link of the chain, and then you have one particle of glucose. And that's why simple starches, especially processed starches that are devoid of fiber, are basically just chains of glucose. And when your body processes them, it's basically flooding your system with glucose. So these particles break off, the chains break off, and each chain is a glucose particle. Now, insulin, on the other hand, is a hormone that's produced by what are called beta cells in the pancreas, that's located in a part of the pancreas, called the islets of Langerhans. And the islets of Langerhans have multiple cells. There's alpha cells and beta. Anyway, the point here is the beta cells are basically releasing insulin. And this regulates the amount of glucose in the blood, but it does this by acting sort of like a lock and key. What happens is the insulin comes over and it fits into part of the cell, which basically allows the cell to take in glucose. That's basically what it does. So it's like the key that opens the door to the cell to glucose. Now, your body, of course, needs glucose. It needs blood sugar because it's the main source of energy in your body. And so you want to have this there's this balance where when you need energy, insulin comes along and it opens up the cell so that blood sugar or glucose can come into the cell, which then, of course, goes through another series of processes, and then you have energy. So in summary, you have this sugar. This may be general, but I think it's important to just review. You have blood sugar running around in your system, glucose. And in order for it to be used, it needs insulin to open up the cell to allow it to come in to provide energy for the cell. Now, what is going on with type 1 diabetes? What's happening is I mentioned that there are basically 4 types of cells in the pancreas. There's alpha, beta, gamma, and then another one. And basically, what happens is these beta cells, which are producing insulin, the immune system attacks those beta cells. And in some cases, it attacks the alpha cells, which are also implicated in blood sugar, but we're not going to be discussing that tonight. So in type 1 diabetes, we've already determined, we now understand of sort of how glucose and insulin work together. In type 1 diabetes, unfortunately, what's happening is the beta cells are no longer functioning. And if they're no longer functioning and the key can't open up the cell, then what's going to happen? Glucose can't get in, and it's going to go and become very, very high in the system. And if insulin's not there, it can't be absorbed for energy. And therefore, without insulin, the person is going to wither away, essentially. And of course, years ago, when insulin was not around, of course, people died routinely from type 1 diabetes. But first, they would waste away, unfortunately. Now that we have insulin as a medication, then we can help modify that situation. Because ultimately, your cells, of course, they need energy. And glucose, blood sugar, is the predominant form of that. The key here is to understand, as we go through tonight's class, that we want to have a reasonable balance between these things. Now, type 2 diabetes is a different story. Beta cells are there, but unfortunately, what's happening outside the pancreas is that unfortunately the cells are just not as they're resistant. Basically, they're resistant to insulin. It's not functioning the way it's supposed to. So you get this situation where you have a lot of insulin running around and the beta cells are trying their best, but ultimately there's just not enough insulin working properly to be able to get blood sugar into the cells. Now, insulin doesn't, so it's a very complex process. And actually, the more you learn about insulin resistance, the more you start to think to yourself that maybe it's so complicated that it's very difficult to understand. So everything we're doing tonight is simplifying things. But ultimately speaking, what's happening is your body has been put in a situation, unfortunately, and we'll talk about all those things that lead to that is causing this situation where the beta cells can't produce enough insulin to overcome the resistance, that the cells are no longer responding to that lock and key system the way they were before. And there's a whole host of things that are going to go into that. And by the end of tonight's episode, you'll have a better understanding of what those things are. Now, insulin also does other things. It helps rebuild or build muscle. Unfortunately, it helps store fat. And it also inhibits the breakdown of fat, which basically means that if your insulin levels are high, unfortunately, it inhibits an enzyme that breaks down fat. And if you're unable to break down fat, then of course, that means that it's very difficult for you to achieve your optimal weight. And if insulin is too high, it's also helping to store fat. So any excess blood sugar that's in your system is basically through a couple steps is going to be converted into triglyceride that's then going to be stored as fat. So when insulin is high, it's going to help store fat, and it's also going to prevent the breakdown of fat. It has other effects as well. The body is always everything in the body has multiple functions, multiple features to it. So it's always good to have a respect for not oversimplifying things, but at the same time, simplifying can also help, but it's important to understand these other functions. So it also manages the breakdown of protein and fat. It helps with getting rid of sodium and fluid. It also enhances memory and learning. So it has all these different things. The key, of course, again, is that we're dealing with this balance between these things, so that we don't want to have excessive amounts especially in the context of high blood sugar. When you talk to people who are trying to build muscle and such, there is another hormone called IGF-1, which stands for insulin-like growth factor. And I'll probably give an episode just on that, because it is involved in so many different things and actually rounds out an understanding of all these things. And so anyway, we'll probably do that in the future. So what raises insulin? Well, let's go through a few of those things. And these are sort of simplified, but if you're under a lot of stress and you're not sleeping well, and your body's releasing cortisol, unfortunately, cortisol is going to basically cause your bodies to mobilize as if there's an emergency, which is going to raise blood sugar and also raise insulin. If you eat too frequently, unfortunately, that is also going to keep your insulin levels up, because you're telling your body that it needs to deal with this food all the time. And that's why things like intermittent fasting or doing things like 5-day simulated fasts that are called fasting mimicking diets or biological fasting can be very, very helpful and have been shown to reduce insulin. But ultimately, you really want to have at least 12 hours between your last meal and your first meal. And that allows your body to be able to shift into a detoxifying mode and give your body a break from the food. Your body is sort of in a growth situation when you're constantly eating. So you want to get it into a situation where it goes through its natural cycles, which of course includes a period of eating and a period of not eating. And 12 hours, you really want to make sure that you get at least 12 hours. So when you finish your meal, if it's 7 or 8 p.m., then you look at your clock and you make a mental note and you say, okay, I'm not going to eat till 7 or 8 a.m. Or you can, pick up your iPhone and ask Siri and say, set an alarm for 12 hours or set an alarm for 14 hours. And then when that alarm goes off, then you know that you're ready to eat. All kinds of little tricks that you can do. Not getting enough activity. If your muscles basically are not being used, you have to realize that your active muscles, pull blood sugar right out of your blood. Just pulls it right out of your blood. And of course, to do that, it needs insulin as well. So that can basically, if you're not getting enough activity, that's slowly going to raise your insulin level. And we'll get into a few of those things. High starchy foods are going to trigger insulin release because your body is getting these chains of glucose, as we spoke about in the very beginning. And it's saying, your body's saying, okay, well, if I'm getting all these chains of glucose, then I'm going to need some insulin to put these into the cell. And actually, believe it or not, eating too much animal protein can actually also have a negative effect in terms of raising insulin, because ultimately, if you eat too much animal protein, for one, that can get converted into blood sugar. The protein can actually get converted into blood sugar, but also if you eat too much animal protein, it can also raise insulin. And as we said, if you're raising insulin, what's happening? You're inhibiting the breakdown of fat, you're helping to store fat, and a whole host of other things that we're going to be discussing in just a moment. Just doing a time check here, one moment. Okay. So how do you know if you have issues? Well, ultimately, it is often discussed that a lot of people have metabolic syndrome. A significant percentage of the population has metabolic syndrome. So what is metabolic syndrome? Well, the diagnosis is basically three of the following. Waist is 40 in men and 35 in women. Triglycerides over 150, HDL lower than 40, BP blood pressure over 130 over 85, and a fasting glucose greater than 110. Now, it only has to have three of these, and but unfortunately, a lot of people have three of these. That's sort of the problem. And of course, when we go into restoring insulin sensitivity section, of course, all that's going to address all of these things. But there's also something called insulin resistance syndrome, and that's characterized by glucose intolerance. So having trouble with glucose, as measured, of course, by, we could say, fasting glucose as an example, abnormal HDL. So that's also in the metabolic situation. Abnormal triglycerides, we spoke about, high blood pressure, upper body obesity, so 34.5 in women and 40 in men, and then some other factors. Some people have polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a hormonal issue. A family history of type 2 diabetes is something that you really have to be conscious of. Sleep apnea or problems with sleeping can also mean that you might have insulin resistance syndrome. And one of the factors that I've mentioned many times over the last 85 weeks is if you get hangry, that word hangry, where you get really irritable and shaky, and you might get, your mood changes drastically when you get hungry. That's often a sign that your blood sugar is just not under control, and or you have some insulin resistance problems. So whenever you have that situation, or even, believe it or not, if you have a situation where you have a starchy food and you just get ravenously hungry like an hour later, that could potentially be a sign as well. But ultimately, all of these things can contribute. Doesn't mean that if you have one of these that you have insulin resistance, but it's something to be aware of. Now, we've spoken about this metabolic syndrome in the many times in the past. And I've also spent a fair amount of time talking about the blood tests that you really should be conscious of. Of course, triglycerides, HDL, blood pressure, fasting, blood sugar. And I just want to make one comment on this fasting glucose. There's unfortunately many people walking around with what their doctors have described as they've been diagnosed with having prediabetes. And somehow their doctors haven't really told them that when you have prediabetes, unfortunately, there are early signs of damage in your body from prediabetes. For some reason, a lot of times when I see some patients and they say, and I ask them if they have any, if they have diabetes or whatever the case, they might say, oh, well, I just have prediabetes. And they think that somehow the difference between prediabetes and diabetes means that, like, until you get to diabetes, nothing wrong is happening. But that's not true. It's a gradient. And when you get into that period of prediabetes, unfortunately, damage has already started to take place. So you really want to know your insulin level. You want to know your fasting glucose level, and all these things you can check on your own. I always say you can always, Quest and LabCorp now have self-order programs in most states of the United States, but there are also many self-testing labs. But of course, you can always ask your doctor for these tests as well. And I would refer you back to one of my other episodes that was called the top 7 blood tests that you should get. And we discussed other things like hemoglobin A1C, and apolipoprotein B. Anyway, I don't want to get too far off track, but the resources are available for you on my YouTube channel to go back and listen to that, because ultimately and I always say, you need to be in control of your own health, and you need to become your own authority. And if that means And that means that you should be getting and understanding some, not all blood tests. I don't you'd have to go to medical school to learn all the blood tests. But there are ones that you should know about. And definitely you need to know what your fasting blood sugar is. But go back to that lecture that I gave if you're interested in some of the others that are not related to this issue. So here we have a situation now. We have a general understanding of blood sugar and an understanding of insulin. And maybe this is contributing to not getting to your ideal body weight. And ultimately, if you restore insulin sensitivity, generally that's going to also dramatically improve your blood sugar. And since if your insulin's too high, we know that you can't get rid of fat. So all of these things sort of working together, if you can restore some of this insulin sensitivity, then you're going to be able to achieve your health goals a lot better. One thing I didn't mention, which just occurred to me, is that some people have genetic, I mentioned family history of diabetes. Well, there are some people that have a certain gene that some people call the skinny diabetes gene. And I happen to have that in my family. And as a result of that, because you can order these tests, because I order nutrigenomic tests to look at people's genes. For those people who have that particular gene, those are situations where I do recommend a lower carbohydrate diet, because for those people, just having wheat and grains can really spike blood sugar and can lead to a situation of some early insulin resistance, as well as high blood sugar, and that's not something that you want to have. So there are also some genetic factors as well. So let's now go into how to restore insulin sensitivity. So, and all these things, of course, make sense, right? Exercise, smoking, reducing obesity, talking about food as medicine, and selected nutrients. Now, when it comes to exercise, I mentioned this a little bit before. Let me just blow the screen up here a little bit. Oops. Okay. I spoke about how the muscle is very, very important. And to realize that as you get older, what looks like might be the same size muscle that you had is not as dense with muscle. It starts to be marbled with fat. And if it's marbled with fat, it's not absorbing and using the same amount of blood sugar as before. So you really need to make sure that you're constantly using your muscles. And that means, of course, that you do some sort of resistance work. That you can't do all cardio and completely restore insulin sensitivity. You really have to work those muscles. That could be bands, that could be body weight, any of those can be weights, of course, but it has to be part of your program. You have to be doing resistance work. It's non-negotiable. It's also associated with a whole host of other issues like preventing falling as you get older, all kinds of, it's associated with longevity. The most potent thing of all things that have ever been studied that results in a longer life is exercise. More than any other studied phenomenon, people who exercise more live longer, more than any other individual factor that's been studied. The next is to consider, if you feel like you might have some of these issues, is to work out in a fasted state. They've done a lot of studies to show that both weight loss as well as blood sugar and insulin sensitivity improve when working out in a fasted state. Next is walking after eating. Walking after eating is profoundly effective at making sure that your blood sugar doesn't spike. And if your blood sugar doesn't spike, it means that your body doesn't require your insulin to spike. Anytime your blood sugar spikes, your body has to release insulin. And, as we've said, this chronic stimulation of insulin because of all this spiked blood sugar is going to lead to a situation where your your cells are not responding as much, and the beta cells in your pancreas are just trying their best to keep up as best as they can with what you're throwing at them. So so exercise is going to be, and walking after eating is going to be is profoundly effective. I mean, profoundly effective. I can't say it. Shall I say it again? Profoundly effective at reducing your blood sugar after eating. So if you can get out and if you walk for 30 minutes after a light walk, this is like just a leisurely walk, 30 minutes after eating, that can be, I'm going to say it a fourth time, profoundly effective at reducing both your blood sugar and restoring some insulin sensitivity. The next is to stand or at least get up while you're working. You wouldn't realize that this would be all that effective, but the amount of calories that you burn standing while you're working is, I hate to use the word profound again. I'll have to think of another word. It's incredibly effective at burning more calories as well as using more muscles. And if you could work, there was I was just recently that I heard it. I wish it just occurred to me now, or else I would have put it in tonight's talk. But there was I forget what it was, but it was like a study where they had people just do it was something like 15 seconds of all out, bike, like a stationary bike or, something to that effect. And that was enough, doing that like once an hour, 15 seconds or something like that. I can't remember all the details, was really enough to maintain a certain level of fitness. I wish I could remember, but the point being here, of course, that just getting up every hour and doing a few jumping jacks, or standing up and stretching and moving around, or taking a little walk, is going to be very effective for you to help with, one, burning more calories, two, maintaining muscle mass, three, helping your body to use more blood sugar and restore some sense of insulin sensitivity. Okay. Next, obviously smoking is not going to be good for you, and it has formally been studied to show that there are reductions in insulin sensitivity as well. Obesity is going to be a problem if you're overweight. Of course, this is sort of a circular argument because, obviously obesity leads to can lead to insulin sensitivity, but you can have some degree of obesity and to have normal insulin sensitivity. And we spoke about that a little bit in one of the toxin lectures, that that people who had more toxin load had a lot more problems with diabetes than those that didn't. In fact, when they accounted for toxins, and I believe that was arsenic specifically, that when they accounted for that, obesity wasn't associated with in that one particular study with having diabetes or the risk of diabetes. But on the converse, when people had obesity and they had some toxin load, the problem was a lot worse. Next is food as medicine. And I mentioned, I'm putting in here something called membrane fluidity. And think of the membrane fluid. I have that spelled wrong, but think of the cell, all the cells in your body. They're all made from, the outer part of all these cells is made from a type of fat, actually. And so if it's not moving and flexible the way it's supposed to, that key in the lock of the insulin turning the key to allow blood sugar in isn't going to work as well. And so that's why things like saturated fats and trans fats have been associated with issues, with problems with insulin sensitivity. And so if the membrane is not sort of flexible and moving around the way it's supposed to, it's going to have some issues with insulin sensitivity. Now, that leads to this issue, and we've already spoken about how saturated fats and trans fats are bad, but there have been studies to show that if you're able to get the right amount of omega-3s, in other words, when they supplemented with omega-3s, because most people aren't getting enough omega-3s, or they've switched to a Mediterranean diet and they're getting more omega-3s, that has increased insulin sensitivity. Now, the problem here, and we've spoken about this before, is that we know that most of you know that omega-3 is associated with fish. They're also found in flax and walnuts, but the best type are found in fish. Then there's omega-6s, which are found in nuts and seeds, but also in seed oils. The problem is that most of these seed oils are damaged and rancid. Things like, sunflower, safflower, corn oil, these sorts of things. So you want to make sure you're getting your traditional fats. And when people move to a Mediterranean diet where they're getting more omega-3s and they're getting monounsaturated fats, and they're getting a better ratio, a historically sensible ratio of omega-3 to omega-6s, then the membrane fluidity is going to improve and the insulin sensitivity is going to improve. But you have to get this ratio right. And a lot of people, of course, have spent a lot of time talking about how when, it used to be the ratio was probably 1 part 3 to, 3 to 4 parts 6. No one's really exactly sure what it was, 1,000 years ago. But now it's like 1 to 40. And that ratio has other implications to it. So if you're getting rid of all your vegetable oils and you're eating, a Mediterranean type diet with a little bit of olive oil and some fish, generally your omega-3 to 6 ratio is going to improve. And this is probably one of the reasons why the Mediterranean diet is going to be helpful for people with insulin issues, as well as type 2 diabetes, as well as longevity, all these sorts of things. It's impossible to isolate exactly what's going on, but certainly if you can get this right, get rid of all those seed oils, of course, any fried foods that you get out are fried in the worst oils possible. I remember, because many of you know that I'm the owner of Miracle Noodle, we, of course, before COVID, we went to many, many shows. And I remember I went to this show in Chicago. It was the National Restaurants Association show, and huge show of people who, of course, own restaurants and who want to sell to restaurants, and huge speakers. I remember that day Bill Clinton was speaking at that event, and I was interested in the frying machines, that were used in restaurants. And I remember there was they had a section of the convention where they had these food trucks, and the food trucks, of course, had a deep fryer in them. And I remember this one machine that sort of just somehow filtered the oil so that it could be reused over and over again. And, these oils are just not stable, and they oxidize and they become rancid so fast, most of these vegetable oils. And just seeing how this thing could be recycled and someone eating these fried foods, it's just toxic. It's just absolutely toxic. So if you have issues, most people wouldn't really think of fried food as something that might have some association with blood sugar and insulin sensitivity. But unfortunately, it does have a role. And if you need healthy omega-6s, which are, again, you can get with a handful of nuts or seeds per day, if you're getting them already rancid and those are being incorporated into your body, it's like you're putting a bad brick into the wall. It's already a damaged brick, and you're trying to build the wall of your cells. It's just not going to work, and it's not going to allow that key that insulin key to open up the cell in a healthy way and it's going to lead to a situation where the insulin is not going to fit in, along with all the things we've spoken about. And if the insulin doesn't fit in there, then the pancreas is going to say, what's going on here? I need to release more insulin because the insulin that I'm releasing isn't doing a damn thing. So that happens. And as the insulin rises, what's happening? Your inability to lose weight is happening. You're storing more fat than you normally would because insulin's turning on your storage of fat. You're getting more sugar in the system circulating, so your blood sugar is going up. That's causing you to gain more fat because it's even more efficient at laying down fat because the insulin's high. So all these things are happening, and we have to get a clearer, just general picture that all the decisions you make, unfortunately, are going to have, maybe they're not all going to have a direct impact, but ultimately we're talking here about things that maybe you weren't aware of. And so in this case, get rid of all vegetable oils. If you have them in your house, corn, sunflower, safflower, just get rid of them. It's just not those, they weren't eaten 100 years ago. They're brand new oils. I mean, as I always say, imagine what it must take to create corn oil. I mean, to get oil out of a kernel of corn. Of course, you can understand things like sesame. Sesame is like high in fat. So, it's a seed. So in that case, that's a traditional oil that has some protection. But olives, of course, olives have fat. So it makes sense that you can get an oil out of it. But corn, I mean, that goes through all kinds of processing and deodorizing, and you have to use solvents and all kinds of things there can't be that much fat in corn. So in order to get oil out of corn, it's a modern phenomenon as it is with many of these other oils. And so you have to pay attention to that and go back to traditional sources like olive, coconut, sesame. These are oils that have been used. Of course, the saturated and the trans fats are also affecting this situation as well. If you're getting excess saturated fats and any trans fats, that's also going to cause this issue because the cell's going to try to incorporate them, but it's not going to let it in a way that's going to allow the key to open up. Soluble fiber is very effective at helping as well, especially soluble fiber. So, of course, Miracle Noodle is good in that regard because it has soluble fiber, but any source of soluble fiber is going to be very good as well. Then there are selected nutrients. Just doing a time check here, and I've probably spoken about all of these at some point in time, and all of these have effects on insulin sensitivity. Magnesium, almost everyone is magnesium deficient. So it's one of the few supplements that I recommend everyone take is a magnesium supplement. You can certainly check your magnesium by getting a special test called an RBC magnesium level. But even that test, a lot of people don't think is as effective as, nonetheless, most people are magnesium deficient. We've spoken about how magnesium is so important throughout the body. It is responsible partly for activating vitamin D, which is going to help with, of course, your immune system. But it also helps relax your muscles. It has a relaxing effect on the body. So if you are under stress, magnesium can even help with that. But it also helps with insulin sensitivity as well. Gynestemma or Gynema, I'm drinking a tea that's called Gynestemma tea that I like, and it's also good for, it helps activate a system called AMPK, which is known as the master switch of the body, and can allow you to incorporate energy a little bit better, and can also, has been shown to help with belly fat. So, that's one of my favorites, Gynestemma tea. Chromium has also been associated with with helping this as well, and has been a fairly popular sort of anti-diabetes supplement for many years. Conjugated linoleic acid. This helps with the membrane fluidity, as I spoke about before. Alpha lipoic acid, which is a very potent antioxidant, but also has some effects inside the cell that are similar to some of the anti-diabetes medications out there, and can also have a effect back through to insulin sensitivity. I do recommend for people who are having blood sugar and or insulin issues, alpha lipoic acid. Green tea can be helpful. So you can have green tea, which of course has some caffeine. The Gynostema tea does not have any caffeine. So I happen to like that quite a bit. I do drink green tea as well, but I'm very sensitive to caffeine. So don't have it as much as I would like, because I love certain types of Japanese green tea. And then cinnamon, specifically Ceylon cinnamon, has also been very, very helpful for blood sugar and insulin as well. So all of these, I would say, definitely magnesium. I think Gynostema tea it's like naturally sweet, so I do recommend that. Definitely alpha lipoic acid, green tea, and cinnamon. All of these have such a long period of use. Many of you may not have heard of alpha lipoic acid, but it has a very long history of use, being popularized by a very famous scientist many years ago, and has a very good safety profile. So we've spent quite a bit of time tonight. There is, I gave a talk, I'm not sure how many weeks ago it was, but I was going to bring it up because I spoke a little bit about blood sugar, just blood sugar. This was more about insulin. And I just wanted to bring up this was from a long time ago. And I mentioned some other natural agents that can help with blood sugar as well. It's coffee bean extract, maqui berry extract, glucomannan, which is found in miracle noodles, also has been very, very helpful for blood sugar. Amylase inhibitors, that break down the starch, can be inhibited, so that those chains don't get separated. Green tea extract, sorghum extract, again, magnesium helps with both fasting insulin as well as blood sugar. And then we spoke about Gynostema tea. Chromium also has an effect on that system that I spoke about, and berberine as well. This just sort of popped up when I was sort of opening the slide. So that is tonight's class in regards to insulin. And I hope now that you have a general appreciation of what insulin is and what it does in combination with blood sugar, and how you really need to understand both of them, because when insulin is elevated, as we've learned, that's going to facilitate fat deposition and prevent fat from breaking down. And anything you can do to help that is going to help you to achieve your health goals, whatever those may be, honestly, that's going to help. And of course, getting the muscular activity in is going to be super important. We didn't talk all that much about diet, with the exception of people who have that gene that makes them a little bit more predisposed without excess fat to having blood sugar issues and possible diabetes. But of course, we did speak about starch and how starch is a chain, just literally a chain of blood sugar molecules. So we do need to be conscious, of course, of processed carbohydrates that are just pure starch, because those are going to cause your blood sugar to spike. And we have to understand that anything that causes our blood sugar to spike is going to cause our bodies to release more insulin, which has all those other negative effects. Now, of course, we don't want insulin to go to nothing. we need a little bit of insulin. And that's why we started tonight's talk talking about all the other factors, how it affects things like memory and mood, and also works with your kidneys for regulating sodium, a whole host of things. But we want to understand that there is this delicate balance that is just completely thrown off track when we have all these unnatural lifestyle factors, whether it's eating fried foods from rancid oils, to eating too much starch, all those things, not getting up and walking around and standing like I'm standing. I've been trying to do that, and I guarantee you that if you try working standing up, your appetite is going to increase because you're using more calories. It's like when you suddenly start exercising more, you realize if you have, generally speaking, your appetite's going to increase because your body's telling you you need fuel. And so getting that right fuel is, of course, is going to be really super important for you to make sure that all this, the insulin sensitivity and the blood sugar and all that, is regulated in a possible way. Now, I do want to mention a trend that's happening now in health circles, and that is continuous glucose monitors. And many anti-aging doctors, as well as lifestyle medicine doctors, are giving patients CGMs. Now, a CGM is a continuous glucose monitor, and you put it on the back of your arm. And I have not done it myself, although I have been tempted to do it and probably will do it at some point. And the reason it's valuable is because blood sugar spikes are really not as predictable as you might think. Obviously, if you're eating gobs and gobs of sugar and white flour and processed grains and all those sorts of things, it would not be a shocker to realize that your blood sugar is going up. But what has been found in studies is that blood sugar responses to various foods vary more widely than was previously expected. Some of this work was done in Israel by a doctor by the name of Aaron Siegel, who is what's called a computational biologist. Basically, I'm not even exactly sure what that is, but my understanding of it is that they take enormous amounts of patient data and come up with a whole host of hypotheses about things. And one of the studies he did was he analyzed people's gut microbiome and associated it with their blood sugar responses to certain foods. And what he was able to find was, by testing the microbiome, the bacteria in your gut, he was able to predict your blood sugar responses to various foods. And he developed a company that actually allows you to check your gut microbiome, and it will give you a chart of foods that most likely are not going to be good for your blood sugar to spike. And we've spoken about one reason why blood sugar spiking is not good for you. We spoke about how blood sugar spikes are not good for you because that's going to cause your body to release a whole host of insulin, which has negative effects. But the blood sugar spike by itself also has damaging effects because it ends up binding to proteins in your body, which is basically one of the causes of aging. It can lead to stiffening in your joints and eye problems and wrinkling in your skin. All these things happen when your blood sugar spikes. So you can see here the value of having some sort of idea of what's going on by looking at your gut, in this case, looking at your gut microbiome. You'll be amazed to find that certain people could have a situation where ice cream does absolutely nothing to their blood sugar. And other people who, you would think that something like something that wouldn't raise your blood sugar all that much, if you look at the microbiome, could through the data that they develop, not be good for your blood sugar. Now enter in this new trend of using continuous blood glucose monitors. Now, what this can do is it ties to your cell phone, and it can allow you to watch what happens to your blood sugar as you eat certain foods. And I can tell you, by talking to people who have done it, as well as reading about it, almost everyone is completely shocked. At least one or two things that they thought were completely fine for their blood sugar. It might have been, something like, black beans. Black beans shouldn't make your blood sugar spike, generally speaking. But in this particular case, in some people, there may be a situation where the blood sugar spikes. And so you can learn through wearing these things for a little while and testing what you're eating, what's going on with your blood sugar. And of course, that can be very, very interesting. That's sort of an advanced tactic. Some conventional doctors have sort of come out against it. But most of those doctors are in the situation, or in the opinion, of course, that you are not in control of your health, that you don't know your body better, and that you're incapable of making decisions for yourself. I always say doctors are divided into two groups: doctors who think you know your body better, and doctors who think they know your body better. And of course, you should always pick a doctor who respects the fact that you have control over your body more than anyone else. Not that you don't need to talk to, a doctor and have a doctor, but ultimately speaking, you know your body better than anyone else. And of course, in this case, by doing a continuous glucose monitoring, you can learn that there are certain things that make your blood sugar spike. And I'll probably do it myself. I'm curious more than anything else. But also, this Dr. Siegel from Israel also created a company that you can send in, I guess it's a stool sample, and they can give you, based on all the data that they've developed, they can come up with a list of foods that through the studies that they've done are going to raise your blood sugar, or going to spike your blood sugar. And of course, now you all understand why, various reasons why that's not going to be good for your overall longevity and your overall health, short-term and long-term. So I thought that's important to mention, because it's sort of an extension of what we were talking about tonight. So I think that's all I wanted to cover. I hope that gives you some insight. If any of you have, say, an elevated insulin level, some of these things probably haven't been discussed with your doctor, or if you have elevated blood sugar. Obviously, if you're on any blood sugar medications, then you really need to talk to your doctor about when you make significant changes in things, and that includes the supplements that I recommended. You should talk, because that means that sometimes your blood sugar will improve, and unfortunately, the medicines can make your blood sugar go too low. So any kind of changes, whether it's supplement or diet, if you're on blood pressure medicines or you're on high blood pressure medicines, you really should talk to your doctor so that they might consider lowering the dose, just in case, because believe it or not, it can be, you can very effectively make changes in your lifestyle that can reduce your need for medications. But when it comes to blood pressure and blood sugar, if the medicines become more sensitive because of your lifestyle, your blood pressure can drop, or you're too low so you could pass out, or your blood sugar could drop too much because of the medicines, with these changes. So any changes you should discuss. If you're on medicine, you should discuss with your doctor. And I think that's it. I think we covered a whole host of things. I appreciate we have a very, very good crowd tonight. So thank you all for sticking around. I'm always amazed that almost always everyone stays till the very end, which is I just think is fabulous, that on a Wednesday night that all of you will stick around for an entire hour listening to me. And I hope you certainly get value out of it. I certainly, believe it or not, get an enormous amount of value out of it as well, because it helps me to clarify my thoughts and become better at public speaking and a whole host of things. So you're doing a lot for me as well by being here. So look forward to seeing you next Wednesday night at 8 p.m. for episode 86. I actually haven't picked a topic yet, but you'll get an email, and I look forward always to seeing you next week. Have a great